All right, shall we get started? Is this working? Yeah, this sounds like it's working. People in the back, is this working? Very good. All right. See, they fixed the light. Okay, morning everybody. I think I've met all of you at some point now, so I don't really need to do much of the introductions. My name is Matt Scalin. I'm a fellow in the governance cluster, where I do a lot of work on informal economies, informality, legal economies, and politics and development. So I've done a lot of work on smuggling, on informal economies. I do a lot of work around informal taxation with the International Center for Tax and Development, which, if Mick hasn't mentioned it to you yet, he will in about 2 weeks. And we'll talk this morning about non-state governance. One really brief thing up front. I don't know, we're in week 4, how like your reading enthusiasm is at this point, but if you haven't read both the readings for today, but particularly the Titica reading, we're going to draw on that a lot in the seminar. So if you haven't read that yet, you might have a quick look over it in between the lecture and the seminars later today. Elodie isn't with us this morning, but she'll still do the seminars this afternoon. So if anyone is worried at this point, she's around. Okay, with that, we will get started. So we'll start with a brief recap of lecture 1, which I hope nobody has too much of PTSD from. But you remember that there was a large discussion of what is governance and what's the role of governance in development. And Mick described governance kind of both as a solution to the problem of violence. So you remember kind of your Leviathan, your kind of Hobbesian approach to this, but also as a tool of coordination, as a way to build shared expectations and coordinate a variety of actors in the service of a larger goal, such as development. And he also talked about governance as built on formal institutions. So that you can think institutions such as constitutions, laws, written down rules of the game. And we also thought a little bit about governance as constrained by these institutions, especially if you think back to week 2 and Chandana's lecture, especially on horizontal accountability. We thought about governance as being constrained by these formal institutions. So the underlying all of this is the idea that this is all about the state. The state as the quintessential provider of governance, the state as the quintessential deliverer of development, and the state, as you might have heard somewhere, as the monopolist of governance, or kind of the monopolist on the legitimate use of violence. So all that should seem vaguely familiar now, vaguely seeing nods, and that's reassuring me a little bit. So what we're talking about today is, first of all, is this true? Is governance in development projects, in the context where you're from, in the context of everyday politics in the UK or anywhere else today, really dominated by the state as a monopolist of government, empirically and normatively? So is it really that way, and should it be that way? And without spoiling too much of the lecture, empirically this is almost certainly not the case. The state is almost certainly not the only provider of governance. The state is most certainly not the only one yielding violence, solving the problem of violence, or trying to coordinate and build shared expectations in the service of a wider goal such as development. Gets a bit more interesting if we think about whether it should be. Is this a problem that the state's not the only actor? Is it undermining the state if it's not the only actor? And that's going to be what a large part of the lecture today is about. So we'll broadly divide this up into 3 sections. First is, what is non-state governance? The second is, does it undermine states? And the third is, what does it mean for development? We will have little breaks in between and one larger coffee break at whatever point that cup is empty, and then we'll have a coffee break. I think that worked quite well last week. Okay, so without much further ado, what is non-state governance? It is one of those classic political science terms that's been used by a lot of people for a lot of different things. So it's a broad category. But it is instructive to think a little bit about what is in those broad categories. Who is providing non-state governance today? And broadly, we can think that some of these predate the state. Some of these provide non-state governance because they've been around for way longer than modern states have, or that the state in that particular context has. Some of them try to be a state. Some of them recognize there's a state next to them, and they're existing parallel to the state. And some of them are trying to become something once the state is gone. So all of this exists. We have this enormous variety. So the picture on the screen right now is your kind of classic tribal council, often in a more rural context, in a context where we think of tribal and ethnic identities as providing a lot of kind of social coordination as providing access to justice, and so on. So that is kind of your most common assumption. If I hadn't told you, what else we're going to do today and told you, give me an example of non-state governance, that might be the kind of thing that's come to your mind. Similarly, religions are a classic example of that. We'll talk a lot about today as governance as providing of rules, right? And if you think of the quintessential texts of pretty much all religions, they're pretty heavy on the rules. So governance providers as kind of religious organizations, some of which have led states, some of which are integrated into states, some of which exist completely outside of the state, but they certainly have a rule-based order that doesn't come from the state. No parliament signed off on the Bible. Then your classic armed groups. Again, that's one of the classic examples we think about a lot today. We think about, the Taliban, the FARC, these kind of groups, which control territory. Again, one of these classic things that we think that states do, controlling territory, controlling violence within a territory, is something that traditionally we often think armed groups do as well. So armed groups within that territory, yes, they're the guys with the guns, and often they're the guys with the guns, but we'll get back to that. But they might also provide rules. They might have a curfew in that territory. They might have rules about, how communal land is used. They might provide a bit of social services. They might provide access to justice by solving neighborhood disputes. Those kind of things are things that armed groups quite often do. Armed groups are also less random than we often think they are. They're often quite institutionalized. One of the first things you often try to do when you take over a territory is give people in that territory a sense that they are being governed. That there is, that the armed group isn't some kind of random militia, but they're trying to build expectations about how people interact with them. So the example on the top right is from a project that a couple of colleagues recently did on taxation under the Taliban before the events of last year. And they had this large array of receipts and kind of customary documents that the Taliban offered to people in their territory once they pay taxes. So there's this kind of performance of being like a state by armed groups. Who else is providing non-state governance? The picture on the right, and finally there's some women on the slide, is the Mama Bent's trading network in West Africa. This is an informal trading network which trades across large territories, but outside of the formal structures of the state. And again, if you trade across large territories, you're going to want rules. You want to set expectations about what you can expect from your customers, what you can expect from your wholesalers, and how these interactions go, to build stable expectations to improve the conditions for your business. An even more extreme example of that is the gentleman on the right down there. Does anyone know what a Hawala trading network is? Anyone?
Hawala?
Hawala.
Yeah, it's like a type of money transfer that informally is not formally done in a money exchange shop. Something like that.
Yes, so it's an informal form of money transfer, which traditionally was particularly present for kind of informal remittances, so migrant workers who were informally sending stuff back to their countries. This traditionally went outside of formal banking institutions, and is usually in a kind of IOU system, right? So you have a trader in one country who tells his colleague in the other country to give money to your family in that country after he's received something. But it's very much built on trust. And if you talk to these guys, you work with those guys, it literally is often just like a little dude in a booth with a phone, right? So this is not tied into a larger banking system. And again, this is very much dependent on rules, on building trust, on making sure that, if you call someone and tell them to give someone else a couple of £1,000s, that really gets there. So again, a lot of that traditionally has happened outside of the state. That's traditionally been informal. So interestingly enough, has anyone here heard of Wise, TransferWise? Yeah, they're doing exactly the same thing. So they've basically took that traditional Hawala model, formalized it, and are making a lot of money off it. But the original idea of it, the original practice, kind of stems from informal money transfer, especially around remittances of migrants. What else? Anyone recognize the gentleman right here? Yeah, so this is the Sicilian Mafia. Again, we think of organized crime groups, again, as a classic example of kind of non-state governance providers. They might have a lot of influence in a certain territory, and they might have very clear rules about what happens in that territory. Your classic, snitches get stitches kind of thing, where there are rules about how you interact with the state, but they're also very much set up alongside the state, but in rivalry with the state as well. So this is another one of these classic examples that comes to mind. But if we take the other side of the medal, your vigilante groups, your Batmans, also technically, provide some sort of governance by, access to justice, whatever justice that might be, depending on which movie you're watching that time, but also, providing security in a certain context. And a lot of times, what looks like a kind of mafia to one side might very much present itself as a vigilante group. And the example from your reading this week, which you've all done or will have done by the time that we do the seminars, is a really good example of something that, presents itself as a vigilante group. But when we think about it a little bit more, we got to think about, is this Batman or is this the Joker? A little bit further away from the mafia or Batman, Facebook is an interesting example. There's been large discussions, if you think about the last couple of years, about what you can put online. What is hate speech? When does something need to be taken down? Twitter, what does Donald Trump get to have a Twitter account? Those kind of things are things that, are important within the world of Twitter, but also really important within the world of our politics, especially if you think about how people like Donald Trump have used these social media accounts. And these rules are not necessarily made by politicians. They're made within these companies. So, and these companies have invested an enormous amount of money in trying to think about how do we make those rules. And then there's an interesting discussion about the politics of those rules. Donald Trump got famously kicked off Twitter. Why did he get kicked off Twitter? Yeah, so he was accused of instigating violence. When did he get kicked off Twitter?
After January 6th.
After January 6th. What happened January 6th? Okay, so there's two versions of that story. One version of that story is a horrific thing happened on January 6th. And because of that, Donald Trump, it was judged to incite violence. There was, a rule that he broke, which Facebook made as an independent governance provider, and that's why he got kicked off. The other version of that story is this was just before Congress got handed to the Democrats. So the heading committee, which regulates Facebook, got handed to the Democrats, and just before that, Facebook kicks Donald Trump off Twitter. Not saying either of those is the full part of the story, but it gives you an interesting sense that non-state governance, again, already has a relationship within the state. It's not entirely independent of it, but it's also not entirely under its jurisdiction. Anyone know these folks? You interact with them every day. It's any of those logos, ICANN or Unicode, sound familiar to anyone? Yes?
We go to like different scripts altogether while we are writing on the computer. It works at the background.
It works at the background. There's one particular thing that they do that we all interact with every day. Yeah. Emojis. So there's an international set of rules around what kind of emojis exist. And there's an international set of, is there now like a new dancing lady in a dress emoji? And is there also going to be a dancing guy in a dress emoji? And, why is there just one cheese emoji, despite the fact that there's lots of different cheeses? So that is done by a non-state governance provider, international organization called Unicode. ICANN? Nobody? So when you type ids.uc.uk into your phone or into your browser, ICANN's the one that basically keeps track of all the domains and connect DNS addresses to domains. So again, they're a really, really central actor in how the internet functions. Without them, you wouldn't find, IDS if you just put it in. You need to know IDS's exact IP address in order to get to IDS's website. They take care of all of that. They're a non-state governance provider. They're not a government. They're independent. FIFA, that should be a little bit more familiar to everybody. Again, a very classic example is someone who provides rules of the game. If we think about instant governments as something that's about institutions, about rules of the game, FIFA very explicitly provides rules of the game, which on the one hand sounds very frivolous, but also, they're a central player in a multi-billion pound global market. So, they're, on the one hand, this is a frivolous example about a sports organization, but also, this is actually a very, very large business. And then the gentleman on the left there. So within the course on political economy perspectives on development, or within the MA governance, people like Mick are also governance providers in the sense that they provide rules about how the course is structured, about which lecture is in which week, what your assessment is, and so on. So we have an enormous variety of actors there. And again, if aside from the women of Mama Benz, this is overwhelmingly male actors, that already also tells you something about one of the features that have been quite common in informal and non-state governance institutions around the world, and we'll get to that a little bit more in the seminars. All right, so what have we learned so far? There's lots of them, and they seem extremely diverse. So from Batman to FIFA to Mick Moore, there seems to be quite some diversity. And we see overlapping state and non-state governance. So So some of them are completely doing their own thing, some of them doing their thing within the jurisdictions of states, some of them are tolerated by states, some of them interact with states. States apply to some of them to host sports competitions, so that there's kind of various interactions and overlaps. And the most interesting way of thinking about this is how these things interact when we think about the lives of ourselves, or the lives of an individual person. The way to which we navigate state and non-state rules every day in our everyday lives. So if we think about the lady on the bottom left now, this is a vendor in a kind of central city market in an urban context in Thailand who is selling vegetables. What kind of non-state governance could we imagine that she interacts with in her everyday life?
The people that manages the spaces available in the market.
Yes, so the market could be run by an informal market association, for example. That could be a governance institution, yes.
And the prices that she chooses, and then bartering.
So what non-state governance is she interacting with in terms of the prices?
She can decide her own prices, please.
So she's her own governance provider. Yeah, I mean, if she has like 4 or 5 or 6 other people kind of working with her and she sets rules within that group, yeah. Who? Traders. How would traders provide rules that she needs to engage with?
There are wholesale traders from where she buys the vegetables, for example. So prices are decided by the traders, and at the retail level, she decides the prices.
Yes, so the wholesalers from which she buys might be part of, I don't know, a wholesalers guild or something. And, as a consequence, there might be rules about how they interact. Every woman only gets 40 tomatoes a day or something. Yeah.
It's possible that she, to start her business, took a loan from an MFI, so the rules and regulations of the MFI.
So there's a private company that she might interact with because this private company has rules about the loan that she's taken. Yes?
She may have to share certain profit sharing or like maintenance charge to the union.
A union?
For using that space.
Okay, so she might be part of a larger traders union, and there might be rules about sharing profit within that, yes? The Patriot, tell me more.
How much time she spends at the market is also governed by the she may have to take care of whether she has the freedom to make the decisions about the business or
Yes, absolutely. There might be a set of informal rules about, women can't be in the market after dark. There might, the patriarchy might have a kind of manifested in this context in the set of certain rules which directly apply to her business. And the interesting question with the patriarchy always is, who is the non-state governance provider here, right? Who is doing it? Who's enforcing it? But it certainly is a rule that we can see in practice, and that might affect her, absolutely. What else? Is that what we got?
maybe the customers at times. For instance, if there are some police officers or some elites who come and buy, she may have to give items for a lesser cost or maybe free of cost.
Yeah, I mean, the police is a great example of that, right? So even though the police is a state institution, that local police might be doing their own thing. And they might have an all separate set of rules, which means every time a policeman comes by, he gets a cucumber. That could be, part of a local rule. It could be part of individualized corruption, just one policeman just doing his own thing. That's not necessarily governance. But, if the entire police in the state is corrupt in a systematic way, which absolutely exists, that could be true as well. Yeah, so market associations we had, suppliers we had. We can imagine armed groups, gangs, mafias that control that market, that provide security for the market. In exchange for that, there are certain rules about what traders can do or can't do. It could be, we the armed group provides this market with security, but the cucumber farm next door is from our rivals, so no cucumbers on this market. Religious organizations, what you often have is a market could be next to a shrine, right? And the shrine provides protection for the market. In exchange for that, the market has to fulfill certain rules. It might not be allowed to sell alcohol. It might have to give money to the shrine and so on. Food standards organizations, which might be non-state customary authorities, market forces. So who's in charge then? So all these are very different actors that she interacts with, and there's certainly at least 5 different ways we can also imagine how she interacts with the state in this context. So that really sets up one of the key issues around non-state governance that we'll stick to for the rest of the lecture, which is who is in charge and what does that mean? But we get to the very brief bit of terminologies, and I promise this is the least terminology-heavy non-state governance lecture you'll ever see. I mean, it's also likely the only one, but so we'll try to keep it light. But legal pluralism is one of those terms that people often throw around, and if you look it up in the literature, there's 5 different one-page definitions of it. But the basic idea of legal pluralism is there's not just one set of rules. You interact with a world in which there's different set of rules, there's different set of legal orders, there's a plurality of legal orders, and you navigate through them. You as an individual might have to negotiate between, okay, there's the informal rule that the mafia has about the market, and then there's the formal law about the market. These rules exist at the same time. Which one do I follow, and why, and what happens to me? So that is an environment of legal pluralism that you navigate. All right, so the rest of the terminology. You'll see a lot of different terminology on this in the literature. And if you're writing your essay on this, if in any way you're kind of going beyond the core readings on this lecture and go towards the supplementary readings, people call this stuff different. There's shadow states and fragile disorders and states of disorder and informal markets and illegal and illicit and various other things. What a lot of them have in common is that they're talking about governance provision outside of the purview of the state. And that is where I think we in this class, in the seminar today in your reading, will talk a lot about informal institutions. So informal institutions in your reading this week, I define as socially shared rules, usually unwritten, that are created, communicated, and enforced outside of officially sanctioned channels. So they stand in contrast to the formal rules that we talked about in week 1, to the formal institutions. So formal institutions, again, we think laws, constitutions, your Bill of Rights. We think stuff that is written down by the state. It's usually written and is created and communicated and enforced is inside of officially sanctioned channels. So your constitutions, your law is published in the state's gazette. It's within officially sanctioned channels. While informal institutions, snitches get stitches, is outside of the official law. It's not in the state gazette, but it might still be socially shared. Everybody in a prison might know. You're not meant to tell about what's going on in the prison or else you get in trouble. It's a rule. It might be unwritten. And it's communicated and enforced outside of the channels of the state. It's a non-state rule, is basically the simple summary of this. The key thing that people trip over here is the word institutions. And I'm kind of going to go over this a lot today, and I'll mention it again in the seminar, because we constantly get essays of people mixing up actors and institutions. So I know when we talk about kind of colloquially about this, we often use the word institution similar to like actor. But within political science, within political economy, within development studies, actors are actors and institutions are rules. So if you think about institutions as rules of the game, you're on the safe side of that. And if you think of governance providers, usually the ones making rules. But we'll get back to that a lot. So yeah, rules. The unwritten thing can happen, cannot happen. This is one of the kind of slightly weak points of that definition. We already saw the Taliban tax receipts earlier. You can find examples of written down rules by non-state actors, but the key thing is that they're outside of the official sanctioned channels of the state. So if the local Taliban, before taking over the state leader, publishes the new rules on how taxes are going to be paid in the territory that they control, that's not the officially sanctioned channel of the state. Hybrid governance is another term that gets thrown out a lot. And again, people define it differently. Maher defines it as the range of contemporary perspectives arguing that in fragile regions, states operate alongside informal and other non-state forms of organization in the existence of public authority and service provision. Long definition. Again, the basic idea here is hybridity always means that something is kind of brought together. It's not mixed up, but both of it exists in a way that interacts. So hybrid governance, we usually think of a way that state governance works together or interacts in one form or another with non-state governance. So that could be, the state police telling a kind of local vigilante group, all right, that neighborhood over there, we'll kind of patrol this in the morning, you patrol this in the evenings. That could be a kind of non-state and state governance interacting in a hybrid institution. And again, hybrid institutions are rules that are made up of formal and informal institutions. So from this kind of come out the key questions that we'll talk about in the rest of the lecture today. What happens when different legal orders are in conflict? And does strong non-state governance make states weak? Before that, any questions?
important to remember that these informal institutions appear with or without the failure of the state. I think that we were in the groups of the presentation kind of thinking that informal institutions were as a answer or a response when the state was not doing its job. But nevertheless, these institutions are like natural. It exists per se. So I think it's important to remember.
Okay, that's more of a comment than a question, but it's a really nice introduction to the next part of the lecture. So that is exactly what we'll focus on in kind of the next 45 minutes is, does this mean the state is weak? Are they already there? Are they there because the state's created the room for them? Does the state need to push them out? So that's exactly the question a lot of people have been asking. Yeah.
I wanted to know the Taliban report capturing the governance of Afghanistan may be informal, but they are not right now, because they are leading the government.
I mean, $1 million question. So first of all, again, actors and institutions. So the rules that they make kind of were informal institutions before they took over the state. Now the Taliban have become the most interesting example of this, because by all practical means, if an alien came to Afghanistan, looked around a little bit, went back to their planet, was asked, right, who's the state in Afghanistan? The logical empirical answer to this is the Taliban. However, who decides what a state is?
International law.
International law, yes. What does international law say when you become a state?
Constitution.
Lots of non-states have constitutions.
International legitimacy.
Legitimacy, lots of non-states have legitimacy. Tibet, you could argue, has some legitimacy. Yeah.
The monopoly of the violence at some point.
Yeah, but I mean, there are armed groups that have a monopoly of violence in some areas. They're not states. Democracy, there are plenty of states that don't have that.
The four ingredients of a state are geographical territory, population, government, and sovereignty.
Okay, yes, so these are common features of states. The Taliban are not currently the official state of Afghanistan. They have all the things you just mentioned. Who decides who gets to be a state? The people? Which people? Really loud for everybody? What do UN members have to do with this?
They have to decide which state have a legitimacy state or not. I mean, there is a convention on Montevideo Convention. It's all the state can have a legitimate equal state. It's all kind of.
Yeah, so you usually try to get a vote at the UN to become a state in the UN, and that usually gets you a lot of the credibility to kind of be treated as a state by all the other states. So she said, votes in the United Nations, the other members of the United Nations. So really, it's the other states that decide whether you get to be a state. It's the states decide who else is a state. So this is about recognition from other states. And the Taliban is an interesting example because, again, by all other measures, they are the functioning state in that area, and yet they don't have international recognition. So they're a really interesting case study to push us to think, okay, really, what is a state and what is a non-state actor? All right, so states and non-state governance. The key question that most people have started with when they started to research non-state governance, the first key question that has kind of occupied political science and development community when we thought about non-state governance is this undermining states? What about states? And this is exactly what Hakeem pointed out. Like, are states, threatened by the fact that there's non-state governance? If our idea of the state is that the state has the monopoly of violence, the state is in charge, that's the very point of it. We invented the state because somebody needed to be in charge. What happens if there's non-state rules around? And this is a key question because they seem to be everywhere. So if the state is threatened by that, the state is really in trouble. And the kind of first most common kind of literature around that thinks about state fragility, what I've called here the fragility hypothesis. And that broadly argues that strong non-state governance implies weak state governance. There's a limited amount of governments to go around, and if the state's not doing it, if non-state actors are doing it, your state is probably quite weak. And that's been really common in the development community in the first 15 years of this century, and the end of the last. This was a central part of what used to be DFID, which is the Department for International Development, which the UK once had before it kind of got merged into the Foreign Office. And it says, fragile states are countries where the government cannot or will not deliver its basic functions to the majority of its people, including the poor. So if the state's not delivering it and someone else is delivering it, this is by definition a fragile state. And a lot of that literature focused on non-state armed groups, on rivals for legitimacy, on states within a state. So a lot of that literature was around, Taliban and FARC and, these kind of slightly more darker examples of the big slide that we saw earlier. Those folks aren't really thinking about Facebook. This was kind of the empirical focus of this. And the concern was around violence. The concern was around bad governance, around state collapse, right? So this was the time we were really concerned that groups like Al-Qaeda could find, a harbor in an area where there was no state governance. So this very much comes from a collective global freakout about what happens if states crumble. And that was a really dominant approach to thinking about state and non-state governance. You have all these indicators as, how strong is your state, how weak is your state, how fragile is your state. This has been increasingly critiqued in the last couple of years. It's still around quite a bit. And there's a couple of critiques, and out of these critiques has really kind of been built a new literature of people studying the state and its relationship with non-state governance. And the first critique was, this is an incredibly unrealistic view of the state. So the idea that the state is the complete, monopolist of violence, that it controls everything, that all governance comes from the state, and if it doesn't come from the state, then, the state's defect. That state's never existed. That was an ideal. That was an ideal type. That was a philosophical idea, right? So the first critique was, if that's your bar for the state, for a functioning state, that bar is way too high. And we're not going into Weber right now, but this idea of, the state as the monopolist of violence comes from this German philosopher called Max Weber, who very much thought of this as an ideal type, right? This is what we aspire to. And the critique has been, well, some people took that ideal type, didn't read the whole book, kind of read the Cliff Notes section, didn't come to the seminar, and then thought this is the definition of a state and ran with it. So that's that critique. The other part of the critique is this kind of entire literature has a very rosy view of the state. In that approach to, state versus non-state governance, states are fragile if there's non-state governance, and this is a problem, that literature doesn't really consider that states also cause problems. Your violence mainly comes from non-state actors, comes from the Taliban and the mafia and occasionally Batman, but, it completely overlooks the fact that states have been incredibly violent, from, colonialism to slavery to police violence, right? So potentially, this overlooks some of the negative aspects associated with state governance. But it also really asks, who are the people who defines what a successful state looks like? So Max Weber, again, the German philosopher, man with a beard. Underneath that, man without a beard, but still very much a dude. And these are the people inside the realm of the state. It's the United Nations deciding who else gets to be in the United Nations. So there's an argument here that, that this kind of unrealistic view of the state has also been kind of propaganda by the state. Another critique, again, has been that it's empirically selective and it's poorly measured. Those folks are obsessed with the Taliban. There's much less thinking about FIFA, about ICANN, about the folks with the emojis, right? So it's been empirically selective, this idea that non-state governments always undermine state. It's easier to make that argument when you work on the Taliban. It's harder to make the argument that the folks who standardize emojis are undermining the British government. But also, this big idea of state governance versus non-state governance obscures all the actors in between. It's obsessed with rules, it's obsessed with institutions, but another critique was, well, we need to look at who are these actors? Who make these rules? How do they interact with each other? And that's where all the magic is. That's where where that interaction, looking at the micro case studies, that's where the interesting stuff is. And that's where a lot of the rest of the stuff we'll talk about today and in your seminars comes from. But also the final problem of that entire literature has been, okay, so what's your policy recommendation? What are we going to do? If non-state governance undermines states, what do we do about it? And again, this comes out of a period where we're trying to construct states in contexts where we're worried about fragile states. And so a lot of these people work very active in policy making, recommending stuff, strengthening states, building state capacity, sheltering us for weak states. All of that was part of a large policy agenda with a relatively mixed track record. I don't know if anyone's seen this graph before. It went around the internet quite a bit a couple of years ago. Anyone Has anyone seen this before? So this was a graph presented by the US military to General Stanley McChrystal in Afghanistan at some point on basically how Afghanistan works and how informal governance there works. And he famously replied that once we understand this graph, we will have won the war. So now history gives you a sense of whether or not we understood the graph. But also I think the larger message here is that the solution to this got incredibly messy, and it wasn't really clear how we deal with that. The project of just strengthening the state empirically was not terribly successful. And finally, there's a critique that this idea that it's either the state or the non-state, again, is quite ahistorical. That historically, this is not really how states have functioned. I mean, there's an obsession in development with the history of European states. A lot of, your history of where states come from starts with European states. But even if you look at the history of European states, non-state actors, the church played an incredibly important part in governance for a very, very long time, as they did everywhere else where European states kind of built empires afterwards. A lot of what we now look at as non-state governance was pre-colonial governance that kind of stuck around while new states were imposed on top of them. So a lot of these people say we need to look at history a lot more. So this is then the second kind of set of perspectives on is non-state governance undermining the states. We've got our fragility hypothesis on the one hand, and then we've got a lot more historical perspectives on states and non-state governance. Again, non-state governance as legacies of pre-colonial states. The tribal councils we had at the very beginning, this literature argues, is not an attempt to undermine the state. It's been there since way before the state, and the state's been built on top of it. So saying that it undermines it is quite complicated. We could also say that states have emerged out of this. That historically, everything's been non-state governance, and the state is just the most successful form of non-state governance. And this largely comes out of a guy called Tilley, who wrote a very famous article called War Making and State Making as Organized Crime. So he's a historian, there we go. He's a historian of state building in Europe. And his basic argument is that the history of the European state is not that we all came together in a social contract. We said we needed a state and we will give up our power to the state because it will rule fairly and justly. But his argument is, well, all states basically started as kind of marauder kings, as, the local crime lord made himself king, took over the area around him, bought some more guns, took over a bit more area, and all of a sudden started calling that a state and started pretending that he was picked by God. And somehow, historically, we have retrofitted that to mean, oh yeah, it kind of has a dark history, but now it's that legitimate thing. So their argument is that, the entire history of the state, it kind of came out of the competition between these non-state forms of orders. And that potentially, the kind of very performance of the state comes from having to compete with non-state actors. So that maybe non-state actors have been really positive for shaping states, because states have to compete with that. You have to become more legitimate if next to you there is a guy who says he's, picked by God. That if you're kind of trying to supplant tribal orders, you're trying to supplant religious orders, you're trying to supplant neighborhood groups, you have to offer some legitimacy. So maybe the history of the state kind of comes out of the competition with non-state forms of governance. Now, the most extreme form of that argument, and that's where I'll kind of stop with that line of reasoning, comes from a guy called Timothy Mitchell, where if you ever want to read something really, really fascinating where you think the world's been flipped upside down, read some of his work. And he has an interesting article on kind of what he calls the state effect. So he says, I would argue that there's never such a thing as the state. His argument is that states are basically non-state governance institutions that say they're special, but it's really only them saying that they're special that makes them special. That it's the insistent of the state. It's the thing with the crowns and the seals and the letterheads and the stamps. He says it's a performance. He says there's nothing that makes it fundamentally special. He says the distinction between the society and the state is fundamentally theatrical. And the Taliban are an interesting case to go down that line. But also this might be a bit too matrix for the rest of the course. If that's what you're interested in, highly recommend checking it out. But also I think the only thing we need to take away from this is that all of these people argue that the traditional critique of non-state governance, the traditional fragility hypothesis, makes too big a deal out of the distinction between states and non-state actors. So quite logically, these people are very interested in hybrid governance. Quite logically, kind of the third big way of thinking about the state and non-state governance, you've got your fragility hypothesis, you've got historical approaches, And then quite logically, the third group of people are quite interested in, so how do states and non-state actors work together? How does it work in practice? So here, again, we have a wide variety of terminology for this. And if you go into that part of the reading list, you'll come around arrangements that work, real governance, negotiated states. And all of those try to often look at local level goods provision. They look at water provision in a slum in India. They look at, how water companies interact with local bureaucrats, interact with communities to kind of make sure water gets to people and what comes out of that. So a lot of them argue that these kind of arrangements can make states more legitimate. That, if states work together with non-state actors in these contexts, it can be good for states. You can, your local kind of neighborhood committee that's informal can be a really good way to figure out, okay, who doesn't have water yet and how do we provide that? It can give you more legitimacy with the local people. If you're a state, you're not generally great at being a state, but you work with a local religious group that's really popular, that might strengthen the state. That might make you feel, well, I'm a bit skeptical of the state, but, Reverend Matthew is in with them, so they're probably fine. So these people look at a lot of how these arrangements work in practice and how they can strengthen the state at a local level. Again, there's a critique of that as well. There's a critique of that that says, well, again, that's a bit too romantic. The people who study that tend to focus on examples that work, and we don't think enough about who's the state getting in bed with? Who is making us more legitimate? Who decides which non-state institutions we work with? Who decides that we might be quite comfortable having right-wing, white militant organizations in the US play a role in governance, but we're not comfortable with the Taliban? Who makes that decision? But we'll get back to that in the third part of the lecture. So where do we go from here? I think the most constructive way, and that's kind of the stuff that's in your reading as well, is looking at this in context and in detail. So if you haven't gotten too much of it's all about context at IDS yet, there is another bit of it, and there's more coming. And these set of approaches really say non-state governance is so diverse. Again, if we go back to the first slide, if we come from your village council all the way to Mick Moore, clearly there's no general rule here. Clearly we can't make a general argument that this all undermines the state or it all doesn't undermine the states. We need to look at the context. We need to look at what are they doing, why are they doing it, how are they relating to the state. So again, in a very IDS way, keep calm and say it depends. But if you're writing any essays that I ever mark, tell me what does it depend on? So what does it depend on? If you've read your Hamkin-Levitsky reading for this week, their big argument is they're looking at the relationship between state institutions and non-state institutions, state rules and non-state rules. And they argue one of the key bits is the relative effectiveness of the state rules. So is the state effective or is it not? If the state rules are effective, the state's providing good governance, then are these informal rules kind of existing around the margin of that? And in which case the state's probably fine, it's providing good governance. Or are informal institutions replanting weak state rules? Is this a context where, the state's informal rules are filling the gaps that are left by weak state rules? Is this a context where they're kind of purposefully left out, where the state's kind of left some space and allowed informal rules to fill them? Or is this a context where the state was unable to fill it and informal rules have filled them? Assuming you've all read Hamkin-Levitsky for this week? Very good. In that case, let me tell you one thing. Again, because people love taking their framework in essays and in the presentations for this week. And that's great. It's a really, really useful framework. The one thing I just need to say, because it happens a lot. Again, they talk about institutions. They talk about rules. So if you do work with their framework, if you take their framework, it is very useful. I do find it quite helpful. I've worked with it myself. They talk about rules, not actors. So when they talk about effective state institutions, they talk about effective state rules. Does the state provide effective social assistance? Does it provide effective healthcare? Does it provide good education? And they talk about informal rules, not informal actors. So does Facebook provide a good rule on censorship, right? So the informal institution might be Facebook's rule on, what gets to be hate speech and what doesn't. It's not Mark Zuckerberg himself. So if you do use their framework, just keep in mind, rules, not actors. Other people look at, What is a rule?
Definitions to adhere by?
Things to adhere by. Any other?
Something set up by those countries that decided that they're a state.
A rule is set up by a country that decided. I mean, so a state rule. You could say a law. A law could be something decided that the state decides is a thing. But your question was broader. What is a rule? A what? Constitution is an example of a rule, but I think you're looking for a definition of a rule. Constraints or enables behavior is a good candidate for a definition. Yeah, I like that.
Rules are kind of regulatory norms that the subjects would have to comply with.
I mean, there's some rules that we don't comply with.
Like impose guides that tell people how to do things.
So guides for how to do things, I like that as well.
Prescribed way of doing something prescribed by the state.
A described way of doing something. I mean, it could be the state, it could be a non-state rule. States aren't the only ones to make rules. Yes? Regulations that are expected to be abided by. Okay, so I'll stop it here. I think we had a couple of very good suggestions. On that, again, if you haven't read Helmke and Levitsky yet, and you have some time before the seminar, do have a quick look at them. The first 2 or 3 pages of that article do try to say what is an institution and what is a rule. Their approach of it relies heavily on the set of building expectations. So if we go back to Mick's week 1 lecture about what is governance, he says a lot of it is about coordination. And rules then are central to coordination. Rules are central to building expectations for what we do. They're expectations of patterned behavior, is what they argue. And the example that they use, which I always find quite nice, is that it has to be pattern behavior that is in relation to a rule of behavior rather than kind of to a practice. And the example that they use is that I take my hat off in a church might be a rule. That I take off my hat in a shower is entirely logical, right? So that I always find that as a good example. If we look at pattern behaviors that aren't just, of course you take your hat off in a shower. But you take off your hat off in a church because there's a pattern expectation that you do take your hat off in the church. But do look at the first couple of pages of that reading again. It's a pretty good definition of what an institution is. Yes?
What helped us during the group discussion is differentiating between things that are where there's a sanction behind it and things where there isn't. This also helps in differentiating between something that's just a behavior and something where it's a rule.
Yes, so a really important point is there, we often think about rules in terms of sanctions. Not all rules have sanctions attached to them, but many of them do. Not all sanctions are enforced, but they can still be there. So trying to think about those distinctions can be really helpful. And it can be really helpful, again, if we try to think about the context. What is the context here? Are sanctions there? Who's providing these sanctions? Who shapes the terms of the relationship? So if states and non-state actors are engaging with each other, if a local religious group and a local state municipality work together to provide water in a slum in India, who picked that group? Who decided that relationship was going to happen? So who shapes the terms of it? Who shapes? Who does what? Is a really, really key part of that context. Another argument about the context that people make is claims to legitimacy and jurisdictions. Challenging the state versus imitating it. So is this a local non-state provider that works with the state, that is totally comfortable saying, we're a local non-state provider, we work with the state, we're just trying to help out here, right? This could be the Birding Federation of the United Kingdom, for example. It could say, we're very interested in saving the birds, we're not going to take over the government, but we're very interested in providing advice on how to save the birds, but that's all we're going to do. Versus other groups that say, yeah, we provide security around here. We're the armed group in this territory. We run this town, and we provide security, and we're the only ones to provide security. And if the state comes here, they come in here because we allow it, right? So that's a group making a claim to the state. Or you get your even more extreme group, and that's if you read the Lind article in your extended reading on shadow governance. You could say a group saying, oh yeah, we are the state. I promise the state told us we're a part of it. So you have groups that are not part of the state, pretending they're part of the state to get a little bit of that state legitimacy. It's been really common if anyone here has followed the context, the conflict in Libya over, unfortunately, the past decade now. One of the really common things is the first thing an armed group does is saying, yeah, we're delegated by the Minister of Defense. We're totally a part of that. Trust us. Even if they are not, even if that relationship, the power relative, who shapes the terms of that relationship, is very unclear, you often get armed groups or other groups in a non-state context trying to pretend they're part of the state. So clearly that's another important part of the context. How effective are state institutions? Who sets the terms of the relationship? Who has the relative power? Who claims to be in charge? Who claims that legitimacy? And who actually has it? To what degree are these claims that people make, or to what degree do people actually believe in them? Clearly, there's a fundamental difference when the state acts together with, the birding society. It matters where people believe, well, the state is actually in charge, the state should actually be in charge, and, we're grateful that the birding society is helping us a little bit, versus people believe the true ruler of this United Kingdom is the birding society. Right? So clearly, it's not just the claim to legitimacy, but also the actual legitimacy that matters here. And I think all of this comparative stuff, you notice how helpful it is if we go back to examples from our original slide. So again, we've got the organized crime group on the left, and we've got ICANN, which were the folks that do our internet domains on the right. Yes, on the right. So can we think of how they differ, how the context between those two differs along any of these four dynamics?
The first one is subscribed to a smaller area, against violence, and what they do many times goes against the rules that the state has. Maybe, I'm not sure in the case of ICANN, but many times at least, they just are in a gray spot, legal areas, or doing legal stuff.
Yeah, so if I'm a strict state for legitimacy dive, if I'm a strict, it's either the state or the informal state, then, both of those are a threat to the state. As you say rightly, the mafia is a much smaller territory, while ICANN is global. So according to them, ICANN is a much bigger threat to the state. But we might find in the comparative approaches some reasons why we think maybe the mafia is a bigger threat to the state.
Any known rules, they set their rules. They can use violence to, achieve their goals. While I can try to play by formal rules and, present certain forms that are, so to speak, normatively accepted. But these set their own rules, which are normally just based on their assessment of what it is, and they enforce them by violence.
So both of them set their own rules. Both of them set their own rules. Yes, so ICANN is certainly less violent. That might be one of the reasons why I think it's less threatening to the state.
That mafia group challenges the state and claims to be the legitimate power.
Yes, so claims to legitimacy is really critical, right? So ICANN does not claim to be the world government, but an organized crime group might claim that they're a government of a certain area.
I think with organizations like the mafia, the aftermath is more visible, like their actions are more visible than organizations like ICANN, which their actions are only indirectly they come out in the long run.
So which is okay? So I think you're absolutely right. Some actions are more visible, some actions are less visible.
The mafia uses direct violence on the people to know that they are bad.
So if we're concerned with the strength of the state, do we not care about as long as we can't see it, it's not a problem? Are we less worried about less visible things?
I think the common man, I think they are more scared of what's more visible than what's the underlying issues within the larger structure.
Yes, so I think what you make is a really important point in terms of how a lot of non-state actors who are interested in continuing to provide governance in an area that might otherwise be assigned to the state, they might be very worried about visibility. They might try to stay as invisible as possible because they might not have actual legitimacy, right? So they might try to stay in the background. But that could still be really, really worrying, right? Is it less visible? That might make it harder to crack down on it. But for example, if the mafia never actually killed anyone, but just silently paid off judges, that's still really, really worrying. But it might be a little less visible, yeah.
also thinking on in terms of taxation, because the mafia is not taxed by the state, and ICANN is really supposed to be taxed by the state and has the ability to tax ICANN. But it wouldn't work if ICANN is evading taxation. It's a big organization.
So I don't think either of them are taxed. Well, I guess the mafia is taxed. Some of a small fraction of the profits of the mafia might indirectly be taxed. Yes. I mean, that's a little bit similar like the visibility point earlier as well, right? There's some stuff that we see a little bit more, and there's some stuff that's a little bit more behind the curtains. That being said, a lot of the stuff the state does is also relatively invisible to us.
There could be a difference in the socioeconomic backgrounds of the people who are interacting with mafias and ICANN. For instance, people from local areas who do not have access to the internet do not have to care about ICANN, but they do have a certain kind of pressure of mafias in their work.
Yes, I mean, you're opening up another whole thing of set of things that we haven't talked about yet, which is, how does all this relate to capital? How does all this relate to different people? You could say, well, maybe ICANN is in league with global international capital, and because of that, we're for it or against it or see critically. While the mafia could, it could really be an expression of local working class anger, or it could totally be captured by power because they also have a lot of money now. So yeah, we could ask where these groups sit in relationship to capital and different class interests. They're not an export organization, they're an internet coordination organization, but yes, they are certainly filling a gap, yes.
Versus what the mafia is doing.
Yes, so if you kind of looked at your Helmkin-Levitsky framework, you could argue ICANN is certainly in the bit where they're kind of filling a gap that's not provided by the state, and the state is very much okay with it filling that gap because it makes sense for it to fill that gap, while the mafia is, well, they might also argue they're filling a gap. They might argue, security provision here was terrible before we came in, but they're certainly filling a gap that the state also intends to fill, and that the state sees as very central to its legitimacy that it fills it. While with ICANN, the state's generally are very happy with ICANN. Right? And you go, okay, fine, you do that because someone needs to do that, and we don't see that as central to our kind of legitimacy. While, yeah, the second goes about governing streets, it might be very central to the legitimacy. Yes.
ICANN is complementary to the state that he was mentioning. Therefore, like the state can bring ICANN under its purview of rules and regulations if it so wishes. But organized crime unit or the mafia, it's harder to round them up or even bring them under the state's rules and regulations. Larger criminal rules apply to them, and they may or may not subscribe to it. Whereas a body like ICANN can be brought under the state's rules and regulations and can be made part of the state if the state so wants it.
Yes, so first of all, complementary. For anyone who's read Helmkin-Levitsky by now, everyone else please still do. Yes, so we might look at ICANN as a complementary versus we might look at the mafia as a competing kind of set of institutions. Whether it's possible to bring ICANN under the purview of a state is an interesting question because, they're part of their kind of ability to operate is that they're not controlled by any single state. And if one state tried to get them under their control, all the other states might be quite unhappy with that. So it's a little bit tricky whether you could actually bring them under state control. Do you have your hand up as well?
Actually, I agree with Reshma about that ICANN actually is the different threat to the state is like ICANN is legal and the mafia is not. So ICANN, even if it's a non-state governance, it's following the state rules at some point.
But how is it legal?
I mean legal in the terms of the state rules.
Yes, so it doesn't stand in direct contradiction to any state rules, but that's largely because it exists in an area that the state hasn't made rules for. Okay, so I think, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think the context of this Italian mafia would be during the crash. And after the crash, I think the state were trying to regulate the market. And they came up with a New Deal. So what I'm trying to point out is those contexts of both are in a they are operating during in a state transition, in a transformation. So probably it's helpful to see that they are occupying some spaces that the state is not regulating.
Yes, so you could argue that when the mafia first started, the state was also not really regulating these spaces. But over time, the state started being interested in occupating these spaces. While also the internet, when it was very much originally started out, was a relatively ungoverned space because states weren't really sure what to do about it. So you have these non-state actors regulating it, and then now states are trying to figure out, well, what is our role here? To what degree do we have to come in? So there are no firm answers here. But what I tried to kind of do with that slide is that historically you get a lot of people who either say, well, all non-state governance is an issue. And you still get folks who say, well, even ICANN is an issue. You still get this idea that the state is being undermined by the fact that we're all internationally connected now. Or you get then a lot of people who say, well, sometimes you have these really positive arrangements. Sometimes, the state can work together really effectively with non-state governance actors. And clearly, it depends. So if you kind of experience any of that in the practice in which you work in, in a development context, or the presentations you do this week, or the essays you write, or the dissertations you write, you're likely going to end up on some scale of it depends. So what I hope we kind of got into this discussion a little bit is getting a sense of what are some of the things it can depend on. And again, people very strongly disagree about any of these points. But these are some points to kind of hold on to figure out, for your perspective, what do you think this depends on? What are the key factors here? What about the context do we have to look out for to see whether non-state governance is undermining states, whether it doesn't really bother states, or whether it's even strengthening states? ICANN and, once you get figured out ICANN and the mob as a kind of relatively clear contrast, then thinking about something like Facebook becomes a lot more complicated. But I will kind of take the proper 10-minute coffee break now. You've all worked very hard. And we will kind of, in the second bit of the lecture, try to think about, well, what kind of governance do people prefer? And what does all of this mean for development? So I'll see you back in 10 minutes. Okay. Is anyone still outside that door? Can someone get everybody back in? Very good.
Did he get the prints? Oh yeah, he got it.
All right. So we've asked, what is non-state governance? What does it mean for the state? And now we'll end up on, what does all of this mean for development? We've learned that non-state forms of governance are diverse and omnipresent. We've seen that some people think they're an indication of state failure. Some think they're more legitimate than the states, or that they can make states more legitimate. And some people say it depends on the context. And, those people tend to end up at IDS. But the key question is, what does it actually mean for development and for the people who are being governed? Someone trying to? No. And one of the most common words you'll hear in that context is the idea of formalization. Formalization is the idea of making something informal more formal, is turning something that was traditionally governed by non-state forms of governance into something that's more governed or controlled or connected to forms of state governance. It's, again, one of those words that's used a lot differently by different people. And the most common way of thinking about non-state governance and informal forms of governance in development historically has been development as formalization. That in order to develop, you need to formalize. And there's two versions of that. The first version that we'll spend very little time on is the idea that formalization will inevitably happen. And that's been a really dominant way of thinking about non-state forms of regulation for at least the first 75 to 80 years of the last century in development thinking. Where the idea was all this informal stuff, this is kind of old pre-state stuff, this is kind of rural traditional society stuff, it will wither away as development takes off. That when we really start developing, non-state forms of governance, market societies, local religious groups, all that's inevitably going to go away by itself. This is the old order, and the old order will wither away as the new order is being born. That's how a lot of people tend to think about this. We're not going to talk about this anymore today because it very evidently has not happened. If you look at both highly developed and less developed places today, you find informality and informal rules across them. If anyone has followed the utter insanity in the UK Parliament yesterday, I mean, I feel like, I was teaching during the World Cup, and we always had someone whose job it was to check the scores, and if something dramatic happened, they'd have to tell us. I feel like we should have had someone today who, if the Prime Minister resigns, needs to tell us. But I mean, if we think about the UK Parliament, because it certainly thinks of itself that way, as a center of the state, and as a very formal institution or a very formal country, and yet a lot of how that Parliament operates is based on informal rules and norms. It's based on agreements between each other that are not written down about, if the government says this is a 3-line whip kind of vote, and then, all the members of Parliament who are in that party have to vote with the government on that, or else they get kicked out of the party. There are all these kind of rules that are informal. And if you followed the kind of political breakdown in the UK in the last couple of years, a lot of that has been about these informal institutions not being used anymore. These rules coming under pressure. People breaking them, and everybody going, you can't do that because it's not done, right? So formalization as kind of all informal stuff falling away, all non-state governance falling away, historically clearly hasn't happened. So the version of development as formalization that's worth talking about in detail is the idea that formalization should happen. That non-state governance is a problem for development, the same way we might think it's a problem for states, and that really pushing through with development means formalizing. And this exists in a variety of different discussions. And as you, stay in this course, if you think about property rights, we'll have a lecture on property rights later in the year. There's a lot of people that think, for example, that the formalization of property rights is really, really critical to development. So within all these different discussions that aren't, technically non-state governance topics, there still comes up under the surface by a lot of people thinking that, this formal relationship with the state, creating formal tax institutions, registering people for taxation, giving formal property rights, the state taking over all these roles is really, really critical to development. And people who think that tend to think that this is due to the superiority of formal institutions, that there are things about formal institutions that are inherently better than informal institutions, that formal rules, that rules by the state can do stuff that rules that are not from the state can fundamentally not do. And this is often around three things. It's around the idea that, that formal institutions are impersonal, that they're written, and that they're enforced by a third party usually being the state. So enforced is straightforward. A rule's better if someone else enforces them, because then you can really trust that people are going to follow it, because it's enforced. Otherwise, it's just, there. Written, we think, is better, because, that way I can access it. I don't have to go talk to someone to figure out how to buy land in Somalia. If it's written down, that, makes it easier to buy land, it makes it easier to trade. Why do people think impersonal rules are relevant? What do we mean by impersonal? Is what? Faceless. Why is that helpful? Why do we want to be faceless? Avoiding bias? What else are we trying to avoid? Discretion, yeah. All kind of unfairness, right? So the idea is if rules are impersonal, written, and enforced, that makes it easier for, us to, as a group together, buy a house in southern Italy, because we'll have classes there from now on. We don't have to know anyone in southern Italy. We don't have to, go talk to people to figure out how it's done. We don't have to be from southern Italy. If there are impersonal, enforced, and written rules about how to do that, that's great. So there's this assumption that this is really critical for development. And there's two ways in which people have thought this is critical for development. The first is that it's necessary for capitalist development. So if you haven't read kind of the open access orders that North Vallis and Weingast wrote about, I think Mick briefly mentioned it in the first lecture. This is going to come up a lot from now on in your time in EdYes, is people who think about how do we get the kind of the framework right for effective capitalist development. Developmental states next week as well. And a lot of these people have argued that only formal institutions can make that work, that only formal institutions can provide the kind of large, complex, legible assemblages and secure property rights to incentivize investment. The fundamental idea here is usually investment. So if we think about getting the institutions right for capitalist development, it's usually about getting the institutions right so people will use their money to start businesses, to buy new assets, to invest in areas where they wouldn't usually invest. So a lot of this is framed around we need formal institutions because people are only going to invest if they feel secure in their investment. And in order to feel secure in your investment, you need the state to back it up. You need a third party, who really enforces it. You're not going to invest like somewhere that the Taliban controls or like the mob, right? So their argument is that you want the state, you want it to be clear, you want it to be legible, you want it to be impersonal, you want it to be clearly enforced, and that only formal institutions can provide. A parallel argument for that runs around political development. So people argue that only formal institutions can protect equality before the law, can protect transparency, can protect, consequently, democracy. That in a democracy, we want rules to be written down. What kind of democracy are we running if rules are not written down? We want them to be transparent, we want them to be clear, we want them to be the same for all of us. We want them to be impersonal. We want them to not depend on who we are. Right? We want it, it doesn't matter whether you went to the big private school, you get the same treatment on a court. So there are people who think that formal institutions are really critical for development because of their necessity for capitalist development or their necessity for political development. Now, if you have any sense of how these slides work at this point, there's going to be people who critique this. And the kind of main critiques are usually that these people either overstate the differences between formal and informal institutions. So that's something that Maher and a relatively unreliable source have written about quite a bit, and have usually argued that you can totally find informal institutions that are impersonal. You can totally find informal institutions that are written. You can totally find informal institutions that are enforced. Again, our Taliban are a great example. We saw the kind of tax receipts that they've been giving out. Those rules are absolutely enforced. One of the kind of things that helped the Taliban rise to power in the early days was that the business community loved them. Because before that, there were 7 different warlords you had to pay to every time you went across a road. There were 7 checkpoints on the road, and you had to pay every time, and you didn't know what exactly the warlord asked from you this time. Taliban took over, there's 1 checkpoint, and what you pay is the same thing every time. So we can find examples of informal institutions that do some of these things that we usually think only formal institutions can do. That's one critique. The other critique is that, again, this romanticizes formal institutions and capitalist modes of development. So another set of people who critique this say, yes, it might be right for, this particular form of capitalist development, but we might not want that particular form of capitalist development. Maybe we care not that much about investment. Maybe me buying a villa in Italy is a problem. Maybe I shouldn't be able to just buy a villa in Italy without going there, without talking to them, without getting a sense of what the local community thinks about that. Maybe this idea that this world is completely legible to everybody, that everything is accessible from everybody as long as you have money is a problem. So again, one critique is, yes, these institutions might be necessary for that development, but we might not want that, or it might not be the only thing we want. And similarly, for democracy, we might argue, yes, technically, we have a formal constitution in the US, or not in this country, or in Germany or Brazil, but people might still not be treated the same way in front of that. Just because it's formal, it might not have all these, it might not be as transparent as we think it is. So again, some of the critique might be that we're overstating, we're romanticizing both the necessity of formal institutions for political and economic development, or the particular form of political and economic development that they give rise to. So if one side of thinking about development and non-state governance is formalization, the other side of that is what's called development with the grain. And these are basically the kind of intellectual friends of the hybrid governance folks in the last part of the lecture. Development with the grain comes from a metaphor in carpentry. Does anyone know what this refers to? Is anyone a bit handy around here?
Yeah, you have to follow how the wood goes.
Mm-hmm.
When you work with it, it makes everything
Planing wood, smoothing the surface.
Yeah, so this table over there is clearly the carpentry table. Yes, so if you're working wood, if you're planing wood, you can go with the grain, and the grain are these kind of ingrained kind of lines within the wood. You can kind of see it on the table a little bit. And if you go with them, it'll be nice and smooth. If you go against kind of the nature of the wood, it will get all screwed up and it will kind of create these little ridges. So it comes from that metaphor. And it basically says that we need to do development with the grain as well. We need to do development in line with kind of the local embedded institutions, the lines in the woods that are already there. So people like Tim Kelsall have argued that informal and non-state arrangements are opportunities to build on what works and to create more locally legitimate forms of interactions. So you can see there's a strong overlap with the folks in the last half of the lecture who say, informal forms of governance, non-state governance, can make the state more legitimate. They argue, yeah, it can also make development more legitimate. When we work with these local organizations that, are local informal institutions, that can create more legitimate forms of development. Because, if we come in with our new water sanitation program and the local, women's neighborhood group is on board with that, that might get us a lot of buy-in from the local community. There's critiques of that as well. So what is the critique of that? One of the critiques says, well, there's a question of power here again. And this is a little bit similar to, again, the first half we thought about what's the relationship with the state here. So that people say, yeah, this can be really, really great. But if we're thinking about the working of the wood, who's doing the working of the wood? Who's choosing which of these local organizations we interact with? Who's choosing how we interact with them? Who's choosing, which local women's organization we work in to do sanitation? Who's choosing what we do with them? Are we going to do a sanitation project with them? Do they need sanitation? Are they asking for sanitation? Why are we picking the women's group? Why are we picking the group in that neighborhood? So they say we need to interrogate a lot of who is setting up this relationship, who has the power in that relationship. There's a second group of people who say, yeah, this can work really, really well. You've got these wonderful case studies of, a little village somewhere in Namibia, and you've got a beautiful case study of water provision in a slum in Lahore. But this is all small stuff. That maybe by looking at these small little assemblages, we are overlooking kind of the larger dynamics of how states are made, how states interact with non-state actors. This is all a little bit too small. And you've got a third group of people who argue that by interacting with non-state actors, we might interact with the wrong non-state actors. There might be features of these non-state actors that we're reinforcing that we don't want to reinforce, that we shouldn't reinforce. So, okay, we're working with a local women's group. That might be lovely. They might be might be democratically elected. They might have a lot of legitimacy in the community. But what if we work with a tribal council that, for example, doesn't include women, or has horribly patriarchal values? We had the point earlier, right? So informal institutions have certainly a long and intense history with, very patriarchal and very socially regressive norms. Are we doubling down on that and partnering up with them? If, again, the women's organization and the water provision is always like a nice, cozy example. But de facto, the US has outsourced some of the informal governance of its prison system to organized gangs, right? The way prisons function in the US is partly through governance provision by gangs. That's clearly, it's working with the grain in one way, but it's definitely not the kind of grain we want to work with. And there's another fear that by working directly with non-state government actors, we're bypassing states. So you could argue that if you think the state is really central in development, or if you think, even if it not currently isn't, but it really should, by working around it, by bypassing it, we're giving up on it in a really, really central way. And you could argue that, for example, especially kind of in the interest of capitalist development, Coca-Cola might also have an interest in working with the women's cooperatives that do the water provision. They might also have an interest in doing a little project with them, which helps them getting in with the local community and make sure that, they tell all their friends about Coca-Cola. And that's been used very intensely. You kind of have these bottom-of-the-pyramid, multi-level marketing schemes that also try to work around the state. You might have development initiatives that do that and that, partner with local, non-elected, maybe non-legitimate, maybe holding very problematic social views bodies around the state. And so we're giving up on the state as this project, which maybe isn't working so well yet, but could be working if we committed to it. So that's another set of critiques of doing development with the grain. Where do we go from here? One of the places to go, if you're thinking about this, is IDS. Because the development, non-state governance is going to go away by itself, has dominated much of the 20th century. Non-state governance in general is a problem, we need to get rid of it, has dominated much of the second part of the 20th century and a lot of the first part of the 21st. A lot of the kind of final bits that I've shown you, it depends. It depends on the context. It depends on the micro level. The work on hybrid governance. The work on how do these assemblages really come together? Who chooses who works with you? When does it work and when doesn't it? And what does that say about these local actors? A lot of that stuff's happened in the last couple of years, and a lot of it has happened in IDS. So if you go to some of these absolutely horrific acronyms, from ARISE to Clarissa to CORE to the ICTD, in which all the kind of IDS's research projects are named, behind that are often projects that do a lot of really, really interesting work on forms of non-state governance. It doesn't always say that on the tin, but for example, ARISE works on accountability and responsiveness in informal urban settlements for equity in health and well-being. What an acronym. Has done really, really interesting work on non-state governance in urban settlements. I lead a research program within the International Center for Tax and Development where we look at informality and taxation. We look at non-state actors. We look at the Taliban and their taxing. We look at what happens when the state tries to take over arrangements that usually have been dominated by informal actors. So if this is something you're interested in, looking around at IDS a little bit can be a really, really good place. It's not all going to be in your teaching. It's not all going to be in this week. But, go talk to people. Write them emails. So finally, before wrapping up, a couple of kind of reflections from practice, from people at IDS, from myself and others working on this for the last couple of years. This is largely what we still need to understand better, what we still need to think about, but also what we think are good things to think about when you engage with this in practice. And the first is that we need a better way to understand the practice of non-state governance. A lot of this, as you said, really depends on the detail. And a lot of these assumptions that non-state governance is always, impersonal, that it's always unwritten, is based on the fact that people haven't studied it that much. People made these assumptions, and they usually make these assumptions from armchairs at universities in the US or in the UK. So if you have any experience of working with that in practice, you often have a much better perspective on this than a lot of people who've written a large substantial part of that literature. So understanding that practice better is really, really useful. but also understanding how to then categorize that practice, right? Which of this matters? Which of this bit that you're seeing locally is important for development? If your local women's group does not have an elected leader, does that matter? Is that the bit that we care about? Or not? Is it about, that everybody can join them? Or is it about that they're from every part of the neighborhood? So trying to think about what is it about these informal institutions that matters is something we don't understand well enough yet. This relates to how these institutional hybrids are negotiated. So again, if Coca-Cola goes in somewhere and says, we want to do a development, we have a corporate social responsibility and we want to do a development project with informal workers in South Africa around, local health approaches and the importance of water. Who do they talk to? Who's the negotiating side on the side of the informal of the non-state governance providers? And who sets up these relationships? Who gets picked up for these relationships? Who do we notice? That kind of stuff is really, really important. How outcomes are driven by the wider political, economic, and social context. All of this is context specific, right? If you think about the examples that you've come across, and you think about how it fits in, with our mafia and our ICANN earlier, it becomes really, really important about what the context of that is, what the politics of that is. So, okay, there's a non-state governance provider, but are they traditionally in league with the government? Are they a religious group that, a lot of members of the governing party are members of? Or that traditionally has, supported conservative values? If you think about the Ku Klux Klan in the US, or like white power organizations, they're technically non-state governance actors, if they're governance providers. So often they're just non-state actors. If they have control in an area, they might be non-state governance providers. But what is their relationship to the political, social, and economic context? What's their relationship to the parties in power? What's their relationship to the current order of economic organization in the US? What's their relationship to the fact that we had a financial crisis in 2008? That has really reshaped communities. So understanding better what that context looks like is really, really critical. One of the main things that I think that we've been doing here and pushing back against is these big kind of large conclusions that you'll see in like a World Bank report or something like that, that will say, well, this is how it is. This is how states should engage with informal taxation. This is how states should engage with community groups in water provision settlements. This is how states should engage with armed groups in, post-conflict settlements. But I think the obvious answer is, the IDS answer is, it depends. But the key question is, what does it depend on? And that we don't understand well enough yet. And these are open questions, and they're really interesting questions if you're still looking for dissertation topics. But also, what I think is part of the most interesting bit of this, and what I think from a PEPD perspective is part of the most interesting question of this, is what does it actually mean to be formal? So what does it mean to be connected to the state? If I'm a household in a slum in urban Lahore, I don't pay taxes. Okay, so I'm informal, maybe. I'm not connected to the state. I don't pay taxes, but I do pay, a weekly fee to the local religious leader who, in exchange for that, does make sure that, if I have problems with neighbors, they kind of mediate a little bit. Okay, so I engage with a non-state governance provider. But that religious leader also runs as a candidate for the local party. So that is a connection with the state again. I'm not paying for my water. I'm getting my water from my neighbor because they've got a water connection. Okay, so I don't have one, but they have one. Okay, I don't pay. I'm not registered for taxes. My business is not registered, but I use mobile money. And maybe there's recently been a new tax on mobile money, so I do pay that. And I have a Facebook account. And with that, I might use that to write angry letters to my local member of parliament. So nobody exists entirely outside the realm of the state. Nobody exists entirely of the realm within it. But where that boundary is really, really critical. And a lot of the arguments in development is people making arguments about where that boundary is. Again, our friends with the open access orders earlier will make arguments about, property being really critical, right? So that needs to be organized in a certain way. Investment needs to be done in a certain way. So they have a very certain sense of that sphere needs to be formal. But, they might be less concerned about, how local water provision is run, or how, local politics are run, or how access to social security is run. Again, other people, including people who work on taxation, might think that, paying taxes is central to being, having a relationship with the state. That's not something we can give up to non-state actors. But the provision of social services, the provision of local healthcare, we might be quite comfortable giving up to local church groups. So what does that say about our interests? Right? So trying to think about where that line is, where that relationship is really, really important. All right, in summary, what we've learned today, or what kind of are the big pictures to take away from this for the seminar and for thinking about this in the next couple of weeks, is think about non-state governance as governance. So that A means there exists empirically in almost every context governance that is not provided by the state. But it also means do make sure you keep in mind the distinction between non-state actors and the governance they provide. Your prison gang is your actor. Snitches get stitches is the rule, right? So the difference between, again, actors and institutions, really, really critical. And so non-state actors providing governance. Your pub around the street is, a private company. They're not part of the state. But are they really governance providers? Do they really, provide rules or services in a context? So when you're thinking about examples for presentations, for your essays, think about that. Are they really providing governance? We've learned they're widespread and diverse. We've thought about them interacting with state governance and development. So there's enormous parallels between the first part of the lecture, where we thought about what does this mean for the state, and the second part of the lecture, where we thought about what does this mean for development. It's also because a lot of people who think about the state and have very similar views about the role of the state in development. So it connects to that quite closely. I think two of the big debates that kind of run through both of these can be summarized as thinking about a debate of categorization. So this is what is non-state, what is state, but also when is non-state, the kind of non-state that doesn't harm the government? When is it the type of non-state that, is maybe accommodating or maybe, well coordinated with the government? It's maybe what the state wants it. It fills a hole that has been purposefully left by the state. And when is it competing? When are we concerned about it from a state perspective? When are we less concerned about it? And similarly, if we do look at these hybrid arrangements from a development perspective, when is this development with the grain? And when is this a type of development with the grain that we might be very concerned about because all of a sudden we're collaborating with the mob? So these questions of categorizations are still very, very open. And then also a debate about coordination. We say in practice, states do interact with non-state governance providers all the time. But who is the lead in that relationship? How is that relationship being structured? Where does it come from? That's the other, I think, really, really important question that's still live. And what I think is productive, and that it connects to this question about formalization just now, is using this as a way to think about the state. So that was kind of, remember week 1, we had a bit in the lecture about the state, and now we're coming back to this a little bit now, where a lot of how people think about development still is about the relationship between the state and the market, the role of the state in development. Are we trying to get the state out of development? Are we trying to get the state into development? Are we trying to develop around the state? Are we trying to develop through the state? Are we trying to build markets through the state? All of these make assumptions about the role of the state. One of the things that's really helpful in thinking about non-state governance, in thinking about all these fuzzy boundaries where, it depends and we're kind of connected or not, is also a way of thinking about, okay, so what's special about the state? It forces us to think about what is distinct about the state. What is different between the Taliban before they took over and now? And what's the distinction between them and, if they were formally admitted into the United Nations? What is specific about the state? And that gives us a sense as well about what do we really need to work on? What do we think is the special sauce? What do we think is the particular thing about the state? Because once we figure that out, that also gives us a sense of what kind of reforms do we want to push on when we don't think about non-state governance, but we think about state governance. So I'll leave it there, but we have a couple of minutes left. So if there's any questions. Okay, I'm just going to repeat the question for the entire room. Yeah, so the question was, how does all this connect to accountability? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, is the state accountable for what a non-state organization is doing? Because it's, for example, if an institution is speeding up a gap by a set of rules, what is the state's role in it? So is the state accountable for what they're doing or not?
Yeah, so every time someone says something, I might repeat it just so that everybody hears it. Yeah, so I think the really good point by Tia was, so if a state lets a non-state actor take over a certain area, ICANN is a classic example. No states try to take that over. The whole thing about, the websites and which code you use for that, we're basically all in agreement that, and we're okay with a non-state actor providing governance in that area. But the question then is, are states accountable for that? If states have made the decision to give something up to a non-state actor, the same way if states have made the decision to, partner up with a non-state actor, are they accountable for that? I guess the question is to their own constituents. Yeah, that's a good question. How else does accountability relate here? Yes?
Well, I want to just put a defined dimension. When there are overlapping functions between states and non-state actors, who take the lead in such a relationship? How do we define where the leadership should come from?
Okay, so I feel like I don't need to repeat your question because you're loud enough for the room. But so the question is, when you say when they interact with states interact with non-state actors, who's taking the lead?
When their functions overlap.
Yeah, so that's an empirical question and a normative question, right? So empirically, the answer is going to be?
State.
No, non-state.
All right, we're going to try this again. Empirically, who takes the lead between state and non-state actors? It depends. You have examples of both, right? Normatively, who should take the lead? No, so this is a question for you. So I've given you, 10 different names in the lecture. They'll disagree on this. People genuinely disagree with this. So in that case, it doesn't depend on the context. It depends on how you think about this. So what could it depend on? If we're saying it depends, what does it depend on? About which institution? So you think whether the state should take a lead depends on how strong the non-state actor is.
I think that their capability of doing so, it's not the same to target ICANN as to target a small mafia in a small town.
I think the capability should be in terms of ability to deliver on the objectives or the task that is being done, the service delivery or.
So it depends. You say it depends on who can deliver. Yeah. Okay, I mean that's a very persuasive argument, because if we say we really care about people locally, depends on who delivers. That being said, the mafia is pretty good at delivering. No, sorry, I'm not saying this to make fun of you. I'm saying this then becomes the general question. Where is the line between that? Where is the line between, our local women's group that we're great fans of and the mafia? Clearly they're not the same thing, but clearly there's a line somewhere in between. Whereas a state, we're beginning to interact with people who've not been elected, who our constituents haven't chosen, who are not part of the state. So trying to think of where is that line where we're still okay with them because they deliver better, it's really interesting. Yes? So you think the key things are effectiveness and acceptability. Effectiveness is pretty much like they can deliver, right? So I'm going to put brackets around that. Acceptability. So acceptability to whom?
But acceptability is a function of ability to deliver.
Yes, but it might also be a function of like local legitimacy. So how do we feel about acceptability by the local community as a good guideline here? Is that what we're looking for? Can we think of arguments against that? Why might acceptability by the local community be an issue? Where might it be an issue?
It might be coming from a very religious and ethnic background.
Not all the citizens are the same.
Folks from Pakistan here? Anyone talk about jirgas? What are they?
Basically, the chiefs or the notables of a certain community whom people trust, and they give them the right to decide on their behalf. So whatever the decision is taken, that is to be taken as the decision of the entire community. But that comes from the domination of a certain group that holds itself legitimate in that particular area.
Okay, so jirgas are a form of community assembly in tribally dominated areas that provide informal, usually forms of justice provision, right? So if there's a conflict between two families around land, around violence, and reparations, they might be tasked with finding a ruling, and then that ruling is accepted by the community as the ruling of the community. Is that a fair way of describing them? Would you say that they're generally quite accepted by the community?
They have to be accepted when they have to be put in place to decide.
Okay, so the very definition for them being effective is that they're accepted. So we think they're quite accepted. Women in them? So who are they accepted by?
Now, the question of women, I think that goes in another direction, because when we talk of the informal institutions, they represent a culture where the majority, where they don't, not technically, but they don't allow the women to decide. So that's why we talk of those, in those tribal traditions, women don't decide, it's the men. So the complete role of women is also assumed by men.
Yes, exactly. So they're embedded in a social context in which women do not play an active role in these type of decision-making bodies. If we now went to those places and asked people how they feel about that, we would get a lot of public acceptance. We would let people say, yes, that's the way we do things. However, if we're now a government that has an aggressively progressive agenda, we might feel very uncomfortable working with that organization, even though it is locally accepted. Because the norms that we have, we're based in the capital, we come from a maybe lefty progressive party, might be very different than the local norms in that community that we work with. So that then becomes a very interesting development challenge in terms of, do you work with that organization because it's locally accepted? It gives you as the state, as the progressive government, more local legitimacy, or do you not work with them because you're also giving legitimacy to that organization by, as a state, working with them? And they might have local values that might be, crashing with your progressive agenda, including the fact that you think that women should play a larger role in public life. So I think local legitimacy within the community is a really powerful thing to think about when we think about states interacting with non-state government providers, but it's also not without its risks. 5 minutes left. Any other? Yes?
On a local level may be different from more on a national level. So I think even like normatively, I think it also depends on the context in which we're working on. Because it's, I believe it's to find an equilibrium between the influence of both actors or the many actors to maximize the freedoms of the population, to limit incapability.
So think about freedoms and capabilities there. That's really, so the argument, sorry, I'm just repeating it for everybody. So the argument was there, we need to think about the capabilities and the freedoms of the people in the context that they work in as kind of a guideline to find an equilibrium between interacting with non-state actors. That's really interesting because, that's straight out of Amartya Sen, right? Who's one of the kind of dominant thinkers about development, who argues that freedoms and capabilities are the key measurements for whether we achieve development. That should be our development goals. So that gives us a sense for how we interact with non-state governance providers might be very closely related to, again, what we think development is. Whether we think development is all about the state taking over, whether we think development is all about making conditions right for the market, or whether we think development is all about creating conditions where people can flourish and develop their capabilities in the maximum amount of freedom. Final questions? Otherwise, half of you get me in the seminar. Okay, cool. In that case, see you in the seminars. Thanks, everybody. And then see the rest of you next week.